Okay, this is we're going to see how it goes. I'm not quite very well versed in running this stuff here right now, but I want to talk about the COVID, the arc of COVID, basically, worldwide, especially where I experienced it in the West, which began in early 2020 and then ran to about it seems like it's sort of ebbed. We're going to say that the first chapter, the kind of main narrative as we know it right now, whatever way you want to look at it, we could say that that's over. Somehow the world's attention has been directed towards these political things, and there's less concern about COVID. But there was sort of a 2-year period where COVID was at the forefront around the world, certainly in America, and we just lifted everything here in California as one of, a place that's been fairly strict about masks and lockdowns and vaccinations and things like that. So I'm not going to get real granular about each one of those things and my opinion about them. We're talking astrology. That's really where we're keeping the focus. And I think that this 2-year period can easily be summed up by the square between Eris and Pluto. That's kind of the main driver of the dynamic. And it shows you how powerful these planets are, these dwarf planets, right? So we've got Pluto and Eris, both of them very small, smaller than the moon, and they're really, really far away. So that notwithstanding, somehow they've had enormous power affecting the culture and affecting life on Earth for people, certainly, and perhaps for, every organism. We don't really know. Certainly within, culture for people on Earth, there was major shift in that period of time, 2020 and 2021, basically. Just it fits pretty cleanly into just those 2 years from beginning to end. And so I'm going to try to show some charts here. Let's see what we got. Sharing the screen. There's a bunch of different things here. There was a lot of attention in the astrological world. Certainly lots and lots of attention about the Capricorn stellium. That was a huge thing that, now, darn it, why is it not showing up here? Let's see what happens. There it is. Okay, takes a little while for some reason. Okay, hopefully this is showing up. We've got this chart for January 12th, 2020, Jeff Bezos' birthday, by the way. And it was sort of the day of a peak Capricorn stellium. We'll show you more. I mean, there's a lot of Capricorn happening. Okay. The center of that was Pluto, 23 degrees more or less of Capricorn. Pluto's right there. Then we've got Saturn forming the exact conjunction. That was really driving. That was the focus of the attention, was Pluto and Saturn together. And that is a relatively infrequent conjunction, although I went back and did notice that Saturn and Pluto were conjunct in Libra in the early 80s. So we're looking at, it's about a 40-year spread between conjunctions. Now, I mean, that's significant in terms of human lifetime, but in terms of the outer planetary movements in astrology, it's not necessarily all that huge. But we didn't just have Saturn and Pluto together. We had the Sun and Mercury and Ceres all together. And these are all very significant, all in Capricorn. And this little series of blue wedges here, see if this shows up here. This little patch of blue wedges is where all these planets are hanging out. So we've got 5 planets there. Pluto and Saturn and the Sun are all kind of tripled up in this fat wedge in the middle, or I guess Ceres might be there. And then the Sun is right next to it. And then we've got Mercury just a little bit out 1 degree. We've also got Jupiter in the south node in Capricorn. That is a massive stellium. We could take Ceres out and we'd still have 6 major placements there. And I think Ceres is important when it shows up in a really tight aspect like that. It tells you something. The Ceres, mainly I see it having to do with sustenance, food, nurturing. Like I said, people who have Ceres very prominent in their charts, they can be people who love to eat. They can be people who love to prepare food. They can also be people who are very nurturing or people who are very much in need of nurturing. People with eating disorders who don't like to eat can also have Ceres really prominently placed in the chart. Now, Capricorn has a reputation for being rather grim and having somewhat of a pessimistic outlook because it is cardinal Earth, meaning it's the Earth elemental sign that's cardinal. It's pushing things forward on a practical level. So it's always looking at the obstacles and the hindrances and the potential drawbacks to action that's taken on a practical level. So having all these planets in Capricorn can very easily create a certain amount of anxiety about the future. And the polarity between Capricorn and Cancer can sometimes bring in issues related to health because Capricorn represents dealing with the outer world and the exposure you could have to the elements when you leave your home to try and make your way in the world, right? Whether you're a breadwinner or you're going out to hunt and then bring that food back to your family. That's pretty much in the realm of Capricorn, that get up and go, the initiative you got to have on a practical level. So Capricorn is very capable, but it does have this pitfall of sort of a scarcity mindset, what I would call what's called the Malthusian trap. And let me see if I can change this here for a second. My writing, it's going to be really, really crude. I'm just going to write this guy's name. And anybody who wants to look that up, they can. So technically, things are really crude here. The way I'm writing this, the way it looks is certainly, that S is not good at the end. Malthus, I think his name was Thomas Malthus. I knew some kids with the last name of Malthus when I was in high school. But this name Malthus, this is the guy's a social philosopher and I guess a mathematician perhaps in the 18th century, late 18th century, early 19th century. Anyway, he talks about scarcity as being this huge driver in society, that the scarcity of resources will lead people into adversarial relationships, hostility, fighting, war, all kinds of things like that. So the Malthusian trap says that as people consume more and they learn how to do more with the resources that are there, they put more and more stress on their environment and more people are born until they reach a point where the scarcity of resources overwhelms everything else and people begin fighting over resources like oil and water and arable land and things like that. So Malthus was a guy who was dialed into this basic reality that we're facing right now. And the trick is, there's a fundamental question sort of philosophically related to human beings is, can we find a way past the Malthusian trap? Meaning, can we find a way to exist that isn't just inherently limited by this terminal end game about scarcity of resources? So this is going to come back again and again. Now, this is something that is going to it's going to be a big factor the rest of this decade, I'm pretty sure. So we got this Malthusian trap here. So let me get us set up back looking at this chart. Now, this is before we're not really talking about Eris yet. We're just getting into the place where everybody had their attention. So we got to remember that Eris is a planet that's really not talked about very much in astrology yet. We've known about its existence for 17 years. That's a while. However, it takes a while to get to know a planet. I mean, Pluto was discovered in 1930. I think it really took until the 80s for people to get a super good handle on how to use it in a chart. Now, our ability to process information has accelerated quite a bit since the 80s, mainly because of the internet. I mean, for what it's worth, I would basically say that the internet and the trans-Neptunian objects, that's all the dwarf planets that are out there past Neptune, there's kind of a crossover between those things, whereas like 1930 was around the time that we started to feel like the world was being connected via radio, and so there was this idea that everyone all over the world could find out what was going on very close to when it was happening through radio. But then the radio broadcast was very centralized, right? There were these stations where the stuff would go out and people would receive it. And that's a very Plutonian model where there's all the power is concentrated, basically in one place, even though technically you've got a few different places, but that's extreme concentrations of power in one place. And then it's radiating out from there like a big bang, right? And people are getting that information. But what I'm saying is that this is a trans-Neptunian object, Pluto. We didn't really understand what else was out there. I've said this before, it's worth remembering that we thought Pluto would be the same size as Uranus and Neptune. We thought it was going to be another gas giant. And then we found out it wasn't, it really couldn't be. And then we thought for a long time that planet was around the size of the Earth. And then we found out it had to be much smaller than that. And then in 1978, we found the moon Charon, right? So 78 minus 30, 48. So we've got 48 years have gone by. And then we find out, we get a closer look at that planet to be able to see that there's a moon there, because this blob we're looking at for Pluto kind of starts to separate and come back together. That means that there's actually two objects circling around each other. So Pluto's moon Charon is pretty big, and Pluto is, it's like about a fifth the size of Pluto Charon is, or something like that. It's which is very, very large, for a satellite. And they actually orbit each other. They kind of swirl around each other, and there's this void in the middle, which is very Plutonian. But I digress. I just say that idea of the connectedness of the world on this Plutonian model of a broadcast, a network, a station where there's a center and everything radiates from that one center. It's a Plutonian model, but it's also the beginning of the internet. It's the beginning of that idea of connectedness. Now, we had a really, really long time where people were kind of messing around with it, in the 1960s. That's when at least the US military started to really develop this idea of the internet and be able to send information packets. That's sort of like the very primitive form of a feed. It's the way information could be delivered in these discrete packets, little streaming. It's basically the beginning of streaming. And I'm not really sure what I can correlate that to. That's a good project to do. But we know that the commercial internet really started to take off in the early 90s. And that was when the first trans-Neptunian object, besides Pluto, was found out in the Kuiper Belt out beyond Neptune. And that was a little tiny thing called Albion. And then it sort of grew beyond that until, there was this gigantic flush of discovery in the first decade of the 21st century. And Eris was discovered in 2005. That was sort of the peak, because we found an object that was as big as Pluto. We have not found anything else in the Kuiper Belt that's as big as these two planets. They're really almost exactly the same size. Pluto is just a little bit larger, but Eris is apparently significantly denser, like half again or a third again as dense as Pluto. And the mass of these two objects is really uncontestable in the Kuiper Belt. There's other objects that have similar diameter, but they're not as massive. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm digressing as I talk about this, and I hope the digressions are not totally boring. But we've got this hash of objects that are up there occupying this point, and there's a lot of attention from astrologers on this, and a lot of dread, actually. And certainly in my lifetime, there was nothing seen like this before. This was really something that we knew was going to be very momentous and also very challenging, because Capricorn is always about meeting challenges. It's a very stern and there's a side of Capricorn that's very sensual and lusty, for sure. And it has a good sense of humor. But the planet, the sign is really very it's prepared for the worst is basically the way I put it. It's able to kind of have a stoic face for the worst. And that's its strength and its Achilles heel at the same time. So we've got Capricorn stellium up there, major, unbelievable Capricorn stellium. I mean, not just this 5-way conjunction, but also Jupiter conjunct the South Node at the same time in Cap. And that is just amazing, amazing, amazing. I mean, it was a mind-blowing time. And I remember being at an astrology meetup in Manhattan, I think the day before this was happening or the day after or something. And it was just, you could feel this anticipation of something coming that was going to be not easy to deal with. And I think we were starting to just barely hear about what was happening in Wuhan at that time, just a little bit. Now, what people didn't talk about, and the real killer aspect here, was that this 5-way conjunction was almost exactly square to Eris, right? Eris is out here at 23 degrees, 13 minutes of Aries. Eris is very, very slow moving through Aries. I'm over 50. When I was born, Eris was at about 11 degrees of Aries. So it's moved, 12 degrees in 54 years, 53 years, something like that. I mean, it's moved about 1 degree ahead of where it is right now. But anyway, we had this square. This is January 12th, 2020. So lots of attention on this Capricorn stellium, virtually nothing attending this Eris square. Now, I was aware of this because I've been paying attention to Eris for a long time. So I knew that this had to be one hell of a devastating thing that was coming our way, but I really couldn't articulate what it was. I was living in New York City and had a very strong sense that I needed to get out of there, but I was just absolutely mired. 2019 had been an awful year for me. I mean, it started out wonderful and then it just took a turn and became terrible. And it was one of the worst years I've had so far. It was kind of for me personally, 2019 was kind of a limit of, I think I kind of went down as far as I ever really wanted to go. And I think I had Pluto squaring my lunar nodes in 2019. So for anybody who's looking at that transit of Pluto squaring their own lunar nodes, it is certainly very challenging. Okay, so I've got a North Node at 22, basically Aries, if anybody's interested. And when Eris first approached my North Node was when I really became preoccupied with it. Now, Eris transits take forever, so I've been interested in Eris as a planet more or less since its discovery, but it really intensified kind of within the last 10 years is really when it came on. So anyway, we've got this square here. So Eris in Aries, Pluto in Capricorn. These are the two main agents, and then having Saturn there with Pluto and the Sun and Mercury and Ceres. And then we're going to see a little bit later. Okay, let's take a look at this other one here. Excuse me. I'm going to take a look at, it's going to be the first exact square. First exact square. There it is. Okay. So only a couple weeks later, I mean, exactly 2 weeks later, we've got the first exact square. We've got a really nice looking boxy grand square that's showing up in this chart, but that's not actually related to what we're looking at in this piece here. That's Lilith and the South Node and Maki. And well, it's nodal axis, North Node, South Node. Okay. Anyway, that looks kind of neat, doesn't it? That square with the diagonal through it. So let's look at the exact square between Pluto and Eris. So that's at 23 degrees, 15 minutes. Doesn't matter the house placement. This is just San Francisco house placement, I'm pretty sure. We're looking at where they'd be in the sky. So Pluto and Capricorn, Pluto's kind of ending its trip through Capricorn. So we've had a long time. We've had about 14 years to deal with Pluto being in Capricorn. I remember when Pluto went into Capricorn, that was almost exactly when Obama was elected. In fact, it may have permanently gone into Capricorn on the day that he was elected. That's my memory. And of course, we had a massive stock market crash as Pluto was leaving Sagittarius and going into Capricorn. two very, very different models of operating. We've got Sagittarius, who's, endlessly optimistic, basically believing tomorrow is going to be better than today forever and ever and ever and ever. And that was driving, an unbelievable kind of go-go market for a long time. Pluto went into Sagittarius in 1995, 96. It kind of went back and forth, did its dance, but when it finally went in permanently, I think around 96. So we've got 1996 to 2008. That's about a 14-year stretch of, the whole sort of internet boom, the tech boom, all that stuff. We had, the 1990s, certainly the back half of the decade was just crazy with startups and companies starting their life, which became, absolutely enormous things like Google and, and then towards the end of that transit, Facebook came along. So we can look at the kind of the shift in energy. Anyway, so we say Pluto in Capricorn, what's that about? Pluto is about extreme concentrations of power, an implosion, right? I've been watching Dan Winter, who's a guy who works with healing machines and seems to have a lot of information about the physics of consciousness. And he talks about how, the ensoulment, the soul, the spirit actually coming into the body is an implosion, right? And Pluto, we could look at it as an implosion. It's like an explosion and an implosion. It's everything coming into one point and then radiating out from it. So Pluto's very sexual, as it can be. An orgasm certainly feels like that, right? And it is really about inner authenticity and finding yourself. That's really the best that Pluto has to offer, and it certainly is quite valuable. It's about hidden gems and digging into the earth, uncut gems, right? That movie, that's very Plutonian at the beginning of it, when he's getting the colonoscopy and the camera's inside his asshole, basically. And there's they start out in that cave in Africa where there's these jewels inside, and then it's sort of like rotating, pulling out, and when we realize he's getting a colonoscopy, and they're looking for polyps inside his colon, and they're making an analogy between the gems and the loads of precious stones that are there in the mines with the polyps in a colon. Anyway, that's all very Plutonian in different ways. But Pluto is really, really great when you're dealing just with yourself. And then it is a very difficult, thorny thing when you're dealing with the world outside you with Pluto. I mean, it can still be wonderful, but it's very challenging because Pluto essentially has no ethics. It says that whatever you need it. And it doesn't matter how you get it. You've absolutely got to have it. And it sets up these very obsessive drives within people. It's the higher octave of Mars. That's generally acknowledged. So we can look at Mars as being a similar thing, but it's faster moving. It's much more temporal. It's a personal planet. So it's much more contained within kind of the limits and whims of an individual person. With Pluto without there, with its nearly 250-year orbit, it's there forcing these long range things onto a human being. Now, Pluto's orbit is way beyond the span of a human life. So during our lives, we're only really going to see a small piece of this puzzle. With Pluto, we're only going to see a little bit of its orbit. So the power of Pluto comes into consciousness and forces an awareness of that thing which the person absolutely has to have, whether it's a material thing or, it could be a resource. It could be a person, another person. It could be a state of awareness. It could be a physical sensation. Like the obsessiveness of a drug addict could be Plutonian in nature. Although Neptune is normally associated with it, it's probably a combination of the two things. And since Pluto and Neptune have been in sextile more or less off and on for a long, long time here, several decades, our awareness of addiction and our ability to see that is probably accelerated greatly while those two things have been in sextile. Okay, so anyway, Pluto is about this stuff. Now in Capricorn can often find expression in government and in regulatory systems and corporate structure. So we've had a lot of examination of what's happening on a governmental and corporate level in America, certainly, and around the world. America becomes a shorthand metaphor for the world because it's had the hegemonic kind of control over Earth. And that's shifting. I'll explain why that's shifting. It's shifting since Eris was discovered. As we move outward from the sun, each successive band of planetary orbit is like a further and further removed level of consciousness until you get to Saturn, which has held that place for a long, long time. I mean, it doesn't have it anymore, but it had it for thousands of years. And then when Uranus was discovered in 1781, that was a very dramatic shift. There were systems created all over the world based on a presupposition of a perfect mechanistic universe, like a clockwork universe that was eternally perfect, a kind of a chain of cause and effect, which could never be disturbed. And its endpoint was Saturn. Saturn was the guardian. Saturn was the patriarchal father at the outside of that circle, on the outer perimeter, sort of looking in, overseeing everything as Father Time. So Newtonian physics could be, in my opinion, seen as kind of a summation of the Saturnian reality. Then when Uranus was discovered, creates this situation where, any new discovery can completely change reality. That is absolutely just mind-blowingly traumatic for the human being who's trying to get together this little bag of culture. We try to reach into our bag of culture and say what we want. We want to feel confident that we know where we are in the world. We realize that we're animals. We can see ourselves purely as that, but we know that that's not really true. We know that doesn't really tell us what we need to know about ourselves. That's only part of the story. So we've got this thing called culture that we create, which is a system of values and things and ritual observances, modes of being, which people have attention points for behavior and things like that, and symbolic values, all kinds of things. We've got this cultural system which has for thousands of years been governed by Saturn, which says that there's a kind of an immutable, unchanging, mechanistic thing governing everything, and that models of deity are kind of built on that too. So then when Uranus is discovered, just the fact that it's there really shatters everything for anybody who's willing to think deeply enough about it. There's that background frequency of awareness. So even people who aren't devoted to thinking about these things, the fact of its awareness starts to circulate throughout the human mind, and it creates a cultural reaction of shock, right? So then we have Uranus. We don't want to dwell on this stuff for too long, but we have Uranus was then in control of everything. So there was a marvelous period of invention as we start to really kick into the Industrial Revolution, and just the proliferation of innovation during that time is really staggering. But we also have a lot of disrespect of tradition because Uranus is utterly irreverent. It doesn't care at all about anything. So, as the British Empire is expanding, for example, at the end of the 18th century, all the places they're going, they're really mocking the cultures, and their treatment of wow. When they were establishing the Raj in India, man, I remember going to a show in New York documenting, the kind of ridicule that they put their revered cultural figures up to in India once they conquered India, the Mughals, and it just, wow, they really humiliated those people. I mean, they really did. Anyway, Uranus is just incredibly irreverent. It just doesn't give a fuck, does not care. So then we get that, and then we move to Neptune. Neptune was discovered. And Neptune and Uranus are both, they have a kind of fluidity or similarity to them, which is that they deal with very heightened states of awareness, but there isn't necessarily a real fixity within each one of them, like something you can really hang on to. So Neptune and Uranus have a slippery border between them. And then, Neptune, we're dealing kind of more, I think Neptune has a lot more to do with electromagnetism than we realize. I think Uranus and Neptune together really deal with the electromagnetic phenomenon. And we have to look at the way Neptune was discovered through math. And it was actually there were actually mathematical errors, like two different mathematical errors that counteracted each other that resulted in the accidental discovery of Neptune. I mean, people thought they were discovering it on purpose, but they'd actually made two different calculating mistakes that corrected each other and then resulted in this discovery. You got to think about what it's like. This guy's looking up through his telescope at Uranus, out there in 1781. That's Herschel. And it's something he didn't expect to find. And then he sees it, right? And then that changes everything. And then we are aware that the orbit of Uranus is like wiggling a little bit. And that tells us that Neptune's out there. And then we've got all these guys looking down. They're not looking at the sky anymore. They're looking down at their numbers. So they're already kind of distanced from reality. They're put into this space where they're calculating stuff and they're not really looking up anymore. So they make these calculations and say, okay, if we point our telescopes here at this certain point in time, we'll find Neptune. And then they make a couple of different errors which somehow counteract each other that result in the inadvertent discovery of the thing where they thought it would be, but they're not recognizing that they were wrong to begin with. And there's lots of confusion with Neptune. There were a couple of different people who tried to claim the discovery. Leverrier, I think, was the guy's name in France. I would say you could even trace some hegemonic shift, between the end of the 18th century and then the mid 19th century between Britain and France. And France certainly held a kind of cultural hegemony in the arts at the end of the 19th century. I hope this is interesting. I mean, if somebody thinks it's boring, they're tuned out a long time ago. And if they think it's interesting, then they're kind of here going, okay. So then we got Pluto in 1930. And there was a long obsessive search for Pluto because we could see that little wiggle in Neptune. And we knew that we weren't really done. We knew that there was other stuff that was out there. And Pluto, basically, I would trace it. At the end of that Neptunian period, at the beginning of the 20th century, kind of the ultimate summation of Neptunian awareness, I would say, is theory of relativity. That idea that energy E equals mc squared, right? So it's energy equals mass times the square of light. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, right? That's what it is. Anyway, the interconnectedness of things and the idea that there's no neutral observer, really, that we're in this continuum of curved space. This is all very Neptunian. The idea that of reality kind of being perpetually distorted and having no absolute truth. That's a really fundamental shift from Saturn. What's cool is that we've arrived at a point of rest, because the energy of Uranus is very masculine. It's like a violative man is what it really is. And in myth, Uranus, what he was doing was he was constantly, he was raping his wife, who was Gaia. And then Kronos or Saturn, came along and castrated him, right, to get him off of his mom. So Uranus is a very kind of wild, out of control masculine energy. And then Neptune I would characterize as being, extremely feminine, named after the god of the sea, who's a masculine figure in myth for certainly, but really, the planet that has a deeper connection to the ocean. So it's kind of like the infinite ocean of awareness, transcendental meditation. That's all Neptunian. All these mathematicians who come up with what they think is a theory of everything within the last, 40, 50 years, that drive to come up with a theory of everything. String theory, probably, it could be put in there. It's these things which are mathematically valid, but they seem to not be getting really they're not practical, they're not useful. That's really the problem, is that there's a state of awareness where everything is permitted because nothing is true, right? You've heard that line before. I'm not sure exactly where that came from, and somebody knows who's hearing me say it, but I mainly think of William Burroughs using it, just explaining what it means, how every possibility is reality in the Neptunian world. But you can see how that immediately leads to delusion and deception and all kinds of really sad sort of misunderstandings. Because we live in a world that's tactile. Saturn is still pretty damn strong here. So when you got to reckon with Saturn, this idea that everything's true, it falls apart. Especially when you're dealing with other people. It's like your version of reality and another person's version of reality, obviously quite different. So when we move to Pluto, we get into quantum physics and the idea of extraordinary amounts of power concentrated in very small places, right? That's where the Big Bang comes from. So prior to that, the Neptunian model, we've still got ether and a sort of earlier version of cosmological constant, sort of giving it an idea I'm not sure if I'm correct in saying that, but it's steady state universe is a Neptunian idea. And I think Neptune as the furthest out, big planet, that gas giant or ice giant, as it's out there in that quartet, right? So we've got Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and they're all kind of these very low density things that are out there holding the orbital plane of all the other planets there together. It becomes a kind of final word on reality. And then Pluto, we get into something else. I think Pluto and Eris, and I think there's one more planet there that hasn't been discovered, that won't be discovered. Very, very unlikely to be discovered for a long time, like several decades, which would probably be the ruling planet for Virgo that's out in the Kuiper Belt. And these three planets, or these three signs, and the rulership connected with them, those are the planets that I think are really about technology. I do not think Uranus is exclusively about technology. I think it was very important in its relationship to technology when a technology is new. It has a connection with Uranus. Uranus is about everything new, but the actual principles, the power hidden within technology, is number one a Pluto thing, and then in terms of the actual raw power, the fact of it, and then we'll get into where it is with Eris. Anyway, with Pluto, we've got this idea that you can break something open and you can go deeper and deeper and deeper into it and find higher and higher and higher levels of power, right? So you end up with an atom bomb, right? This thing that's splitting this very, very infinitesimally tiny thing and then blowing it up, just this huge, huge amounts of power coming out of it. There's a little part of that that's Haumea, but mainly the principle behind it is Plutonian. Now, Haumea is a planet without a rulership. So that is something to bear in mind, that we're not really going to have a sign rulership attached to Haumea. I will talk about Haumea on this channel. Mainly I'll talk about Eris, and then I'll talk about Haumea. We've got a lot of stuff happening with Haumea right now. It's really hard to see yourself when it's not a mirror. My shoulders are kind of funky. Everything's kind of weird. So anyway, really, really intense concentrations of power with Pluto. And we can look at the discovery of Pluto, how it was this long obsessive thing with this guy, Percival Lowell. And let's see if we can do a screen share just to show, what we're talking about here. I'm going to blow this up. It's very pixelated. But as you see the cursor, hopefully it's circling this combination of a P and L. That's for Percival Lowell, right? And it's also the first two letters of Pluto. And he was obsessed with finding it, and then he died. He died before he found it. He took well over a decade he spent looking for it. So that whole entire time of that is like the buildup and the search. You can feel the power sort of moving away from Neptune. Neptune doesn't care, right? Neptune's selfless and everything's true. So why would it care about holding on to power for any reason? So that fuzzy border, and then, all the power is kind of drawing and focusing in onto this discovery point. And Percival Lowell died before Pluto was found. Then he was in effect resurrected like Osiris and Horus. It's his Horus or his Jesus for God, the Father, reincarnating as Christ in a way, his son being the same entity. It was this guy, Clyde Tombaugh, a very young guy, who discovered Pluto when he was 26. So he was deliberately carrying out Percival Lowell's things out in the observatory that he had out in, I believe it's Arizona. It's out in the Southwest desert. So it's an American discovery and it's American century, meaning 1930 to 2005. Now, 2005, Eris was discovered, and there was just an enormous, irreversible hegemonic shift that occurred at the time that it was discovered. Now we're only really feeling it now. Got to recognize, and I really became committed to this thought over the past, certainly over the past 5-6 years, that this hegemonic shift is just an irreversible, irretrievable thing. It is a done deal. It is a fait accompli, I guess is what they say. My French is terrible, but the hegemony has shifted away from the United States. Where's it going? Primarily to China, but then China is okay with a multipolar world. So Eris, what an easygoing planet. When we found Pluto really kept a secret from us that there were so many other objects like it that were out there, and it held on to that secret all the time. Just like Scorpios are very, they milk a lot of power out of secrets, out of not telling you everything you need to know. And that, they'll give up the information if you discover it, but they won't just outright tell you usually. So Pluto's out there kind of fooling us into thinking it's the only object. And there's many, 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 many spiritual and self-help disciplines that are kind of anchored by this misconception that Pluto is the ultimate thing that's out there. And they really don't like acknowledging the fact that something else has been discovered. Eris. There were other trans-Neptunian objects that have been discovered, but there's none that was equal in size to Pluto. There was nothing that was on an orbital harmonic the same way that Pluto is, and nothing that has rulership like Eris does. Eris rules Libra, in my opinion. And a lot of other people think this too, has not quite caught on in the mainstream of astrology, but it sure is gonna pretty soon. I can guarantee you that. So Eris rules Libra, right? Pluto rules Scorpio, Eris rules Libra. We've got a funny disconnect as we go from Jupiter to Saturn to Uranus to Neptune. We actually go in a straight line through the last 4 signs of the zodiac, right? We go through Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. Those are the rulerships assigned to those planets. And then a really funny thing happens. We move away from these really, really big, gaseous, low density objects, which have an enormous power to hold all the planets kind of on this orbital plane. And they're orderly. They line up on the same plane with each other very, very easily. And then we go to these little tiny solid things, which are very willful and rocky, solid. It's very dense. And when you're dealing with a rocky planet or a telluric planet, a solid planet, that density creates a willfulness. It does not want to adhere to that plane. And the only reason it really does is because these giants, right, the Jovian planets, those 4 Jovian planets, are just so big. So we got Eris out there, and Eris is a planet that's about sharing. That's really what it's about. It's about sharing. It's about the power of sharing. Sharing is a process, an Iridian process. There's 2 kinds of sharing the way I recognize it. There's a sharing that's Uranian, and there's a sharing that's Iridian, right? There's a sharing that deals with the planet Uranus, and there's a sharing that is under the rulership of Eris. Uranian rulership is a little bit like torrenting. It is like dumping information out there for free and letting people have it, but there's no interest at all in what people think about it or what they do with it. You're just putting it out there. Okay. Think about Prometheus when he shared the how to make fire, right, with humans. He taught them the secret of fire. He did it perhaps with some good intentions, but he didn't stick around to see what they would do with it. And that's why he got punished, right? So the Prometheus is connected with the planet Uranus. So that's Uranian sharing. It's a dumping, right? So you ever notice when somebody like shares something with you, but they really don't care that much if you take it or not? It's like when there's a free box, right? And there's stuff out there. It doesn't really have the kind of warmth that somebody handing you something and waiting to see if you like it or not. That's Iridian sharing. Okay. So what is social media all about? It's about this process of sharing. Likes. What are we getting? Likes. We want to know what people think. That is Eris. Eris is about a process of sharing. It's about knowing yourself through the eyes of other people, understanding yourself through the perceptions of others, right? Pluto is completely uncompromising. It says that your own view of yourself is all that matters. And when you're alone, that's correct. But when you're dealing socially with anyone, even just one other person, you're entering into an Iridian construct. You're entering into the world of Eris that is governed really by the reactions and perceptions of other people to you, right? So if you are wanting to be good, then you have to kind of work out with the other people in your world what that conception of good is, what it means, and then you'll be defined as good or bad by agreement. It's what people are thinking about you. Now, we could say that, okay, this is cultural relativism and it becomes meaningless, but the truth is that generally speaking, there's a pretty reliable metric just on a very basic level that steers people towards kindness, compassion, all these kinds of things in terms of their dealings with each other, that this is understood, that it's a Libran kind of reality is basically what I'm saying. There's a little part of it that is okay with fighting, but it's fighting for a reason. It's ethics. You're sharing yourself with other people by being there. You have your own conception of yourself before you meet anybody, right? You have your own conception of who you are. And the thing is that who you think you are is only a small part of who you are, right? Because we all see this in to some degree with everybody we know, and more so with some in others, that there's a space between these things. People who are extraordinarily unself-aware, right? That they have enormous social problems because they cannot integrate the other person's conception of who they are with who they think they are. And then people who are very socially adroit, their antenna is out and they're able to kind of gauge that and see what other people think and start to work and arrive at a compromise, right? So compromise doesn't feel very sexy, right? Pluto, that's kind of like where the real hot sex is there with Pluto. But with Eris, there's coexistence, there's relationship, there's the ability to set up an agreement where you can get together repeatedly, and you can form a tribe, you can form alliances. You share yourself with another person. You learn about yourself through that person's perceptions of who you are. And through your interactions with various other people, you start to develop a coordinated awareness of a value system. You have arguments basically about ethics. And that's where the so-called chaos of Eris comes in, which is not it's primarily not a chaotic planet. I think Uranus has got the market on chaos really, really well cornered, but Eris creates this friction, this kind of fractious engagement about what is good and what is right and what can we agree upon. And it's ever shifting, it's ever evolving. Eris is, I believe, the higher octave of Venus. I think I could take that. You could take that to the bank. All right. People don't realize how true that is, but it certainly will be known. So you get the sharing process, and it leads to tribal alignments and explorations of ethics. All these things are here in Eris. So you can see how the world has shifted into an Iridian awareness since 2005. In 2005 was that discovery point. YouTube started in 2005. I think Twitter may have been started in 2007, something like that. Social media really explodes. Facebook, because we have precursors to Facebook, but Facebook really starts to take off around maybe 2007, 2008. Anyway, social media was in there was kind of an alembic, where there's like all this stuff bubbling up, all these different social media sites kind of competing with each other. We had Friendster and MySpace and Orkut and all these other things, LinkedIn, all these things were happening in that sort of primordial ooze there that was around in the mid first decade of the 21st century, the 2000s. So now here we are at a really advanced stage here, and we've just got through this square. I'm sorry, I got to go back to the square. So I just want to point this out. So your Eris has been in Aries. Sorry, let me see. Let me get, I'm not screen sharing. Hold on a second here. Little feeble still with this here. Okay, so we've got Eris in Aries. Aries has been in Aries since 1920. Well, it first came in 1922. Judy Garland, actually born during the very first week of the Aries ingress, is the first Hollywood star with Eris and Aries, the oldest one. I can get into that. It's no accident that she was Dorothy, Judy Garland. Anyway, so we've got Eris and Aries. So that's been with us for a very long time. Eris has a really elliptical orbit, so it spends a huge amount of time in Aries, and then it goes much faster when it's on the other side of the zodiac through Leo and Virgo and Libra. So what's Eris and Aries about? It's about a conception of the good that is resting on individual autonomy. That's one of the main things that I think it is about. It's brash and it's bold, obviously. And, we're getting into the home stretch here. And so as Eris is gaining power, we're starting to see all kinds of things going on with it. I'm getting a little tired because I've been going through lots of information. It's kind of just pouring out of me. The only way I can do these things is like this. So I have to kind of keep doing it very frequently in order for me to really get a handle on it and be able to talk about it. So Eris in Aries, it's Aries is if Eris rules Libra, then Aries being the opposite sign would be the detriment, right? So we've got a planet that spends 125 years in detriment out of a 560 roughly year orbit, right? So spend a lot of time in detriment. Detriment just means that sign placement is it's the opposite of the home. It's the opposite of rulership. So it's creates kind of paradoxical problems where Aries has a tremendous enthusiasm to know about what other people think, but then it can't really quite see it. And it's kind of one of the outstanding qualities of Aries is its egocentricity, its inability to see things from anyone else's viewpoint. So with Eris and Aries, we've got this tremendous enthusiasm to know what other people think about us, but perhaps not a really great ability to process that information. So you can kind of see how all these Twitter battles and the kind of all the funny kind of things that come out of social media, the weird sort of blind spots that people have recognizing themselves that create this embarrassment, and shaming or just, winning moments too at the same time, where you kind of, you say something exceptional or do something exceptionally witty or become popular for a moment. That whole idea of everyone becoming famous for 15 minutes, that Warhol prediction, has really come through with Eris. And it's, we've really destroyed the model of the Hollywood star, which was really a Plutonian thing. All the power being concentrated in one place, like whether it's Hollywood or it's Hong Kong or, other towns that have, Bollywood, places that have an entertainment industry focused there. With the new viral model, anybody can upload something and become famous. And there's so many people becoming famous that there's no longer any conception of one center. And we look at something like the Oscars, which just happened. And then there was the Will Smith thing where he slapped Chris Rock, just to let you know, this was made very soon after that happened. It's very sad, all of it. It just seems ridiculous. You're seeing these very wealthy people who are sort of somehow no longer relevant. I mean, they really have to reach for these very broad kind of dumb things that are just no different really than little tiny viral videos that you might see on TikTok or somewhere else, and I'm not putting that down. I'm saying that the thing that a person does on their own in their home and uploads and suddenly gets, millions and millions of views, there's really no way to say that that's worth any less than a Hollywood movie at this point, or a movie star's value is really not any greater than that of any other random person. I get TikTok videos from a guy in the Philippines who sings, and I have no idea what he's doing. He just seems like a guy who has another job, and he just sort of randomly sings stuff. He's got a beautiful voice. And he looks kind of funny, but he's also very charismatic and handsome in a certain way. And he just sort of pops in and he does something, and it's just an example of somebody from who would never, ever have been given any attention in that Plutonian world, where there's just these centers that beam things out and we're supposed to just receive it. When we've got that multipolar perspective, that's an Iridian perspective, then the individual anywhere can become famous, especially during this Eris and Aries thing. It's, just to go for it is the thing, and put yourself out there. And it's kind of just an extraordinarily beautiful thing that I'm glad I've lived to witness, is the shift between these two things. I like both of them. I loved movies when I was a kid. They certainly aren't as good as they were. I mean, it's just very rare that there's one that's as good as the old days when they used to just routinely be able to see something that was reliably deep and entertaining. And I know I sound like an old man when I say that, but I think that, what's positive is that on YouTube, I'll never run out of fascinating things. Every single day, people are cranking out just brilliant stuff on any subject you can think of. And I think TikTok's really good. It's not quite my bag, but there's just everything out there is just an overwhelming plethora, an abundance, an overflowing abundance of media being created by people to be shared. So Eris is about sharing. It's about the sharing process. It's particularly about a sharing process where you care, right? Sharing is caring, right? That's Iridian sharing. When you share something and you wait to see what somebody thinks, do you like it or you not like it? There's an investment there. There's an involvement, personal engagement that I think is beautiful. That's really in there with Eris. So we've got Eris and Aries highlighting the importance of the individual autonomy, squaring with Pluto in Capricorn, which is primarily finding its expression through corporate activities and governmental policy. I'm casting a very broad net over these things so we can talk about them in broad strokes and just kind of get to the pith of what's been happening. So with Pluto there, Pluto's really the actor, is the faster moving planet. It's the one that's acting on Eris. It sort of seems like Eris is standing still while Pluto comes up and hits it, even though Pluto's moving very, very slowly itself. So that's the first square, January 26th. That's 2 weeks after the Eris, the Capricorn stellium. That was the Capricorn stellium got all the attention. No comments about Eris at all in the mainstream of astrology at all. Heard nothing during that time. So that's the first one. And of course, we know that COVID was starting then. I've actually, in January 26th, I was in Austin, Texas with a friend of mine. We're watching clips of Wuhan, and they're talking about, the lockdown in Wuhan, crazy shit, right? So, they want to seal people into their apartments, and this disease is extraordinarily contagious, and gives people these high. They really didn't understand very much about it, but they said at the time they were saying it give you a really high fever, and then you might die. And then the respiratory part of it sort of started to become more and more understood. But on that day, I remember watching it, and I was saying, man, I know this is in New York. I was living in New York at the time. I said, I know this has got to be there. And then if it's in New York, then it's going to be all over the world. And we're all going to have to be dealing with some form of this. And the person that was watching this stuff with me did not really want to believe, kind of dismissed it. But, I knew, I was like, okay. So this is the thing. I immediately got that feeling intuitively. Okay, this is going to be 2 years. And then really the light bulb went off. Of course, this is Eris and Pluto and square. That's what this is. This is the vehicle, right? It's the disease, which is kind of a little bit of a thing of Capricorn, is, the things you're exposed to when you go outside of your home. And then the enormous social hindrances and curtailments to autonomy. That's the square of Pluto to Eris and Aries. And the governmental policies, the draconian policies, and the controversies, and the social fracture, right? Because every time you have squares with Eris, you've got social fracture. You've got things being introduced which cause tribes to form, like tribal realignments, right? And people being kicked out of tribes, joining other tribes. We've got this idea that the people who want to wear the masks, they're the primarily Democrats, and then like people who don't want to wear them, they're Trump supporters. And there's kind of this weird thing, this ultimately, when you try to pick it apart, it doesn't make very much sense. But in terms of tribal shorthand, intuitively, people are picking up on this immediately and going, oh yeah, sure. Okay. So if you're in for one part of this, then you're supposed to be in for all these other things. So, if for whatever reason you don't believe in a vaccine, you don't believe in a mask, then immediately kind of go over to Trump. And ironically enough, Trump is really enforcing, he wants people to get vaccines. He didn't like wearing masks, but he did seem to support the vaccines. Now, I'm not saying anything positive or negative about any of these different things. I'm just pointing out the controversies and the clashes, and how they're very much an articulation of this Plutonian and Iridian square. That's really what's creating it. And so we got the first one there, right? I'm going to go back, show that